Good morning, everyone. Dobro jutro. Today we continue with our discussions. Yesterday was a very fruitful one. So today we have a Croatian lineup here. Mr. Stjepo is our president of Center for the Renewal of Culture. Mr. Robin Harris, Croatian citizen, historian, author of Stepinac's autobiography, Dubrovnik, book History of Dubrovnik, and Margaret Thatcher's former advisor. And we have Alex Chafuen, Managing Director of International Affairs in Acton Institute. He is also, as he said, from Croatia. His grandmother and grandfather are from Croatia. So nice to have you all again this morning. First will be Alex. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be with you and to speak about a topic where I devoted my entire professional life, the promotion of economic freedom. So I will first try to show you the problem, and describe, define the words and the concepts, and then I will give you some ideas on how to fight the battle for more economic freedom and for a smaller government, a government more respectful of economic freedoms. I have a lot of questions. I have been asking questions about how you feel about Croatia, about your economic environment, but as an outsider, I have been in Croatia only twice before. I do not know the nuances, the details of what you confront each day, as a politician, as a public affairs or as a public policy person. You are the ones who know how difficult it is to get a job in Croatia and what are the barriers better than what the numbers show. The only thing that I can study is the statistics, the studies, the analysis that are done by other people. Let's start first by economic freedom. Those of you who were here during my first presentation know that I defined political economic freedom as the right of adults to try to do what they want with what they own. That is economic freedom. What you own is what you obtain through contracts, through your labor, as John Locke said, through gifts, or through inheritance. And the ability to exercise that right, to buy, to move, to exchange, to give gifts, to receive gifts, that is economic freedom. The topic has been discussed for centuries, but it was only around 30 years ago where an organization that I had the luck, I joined the organization on the board, Fraser Institute, 31 years ago, and today we have a board meeting. It's like the leading think tank in Canada, and a couple of other organizations decided to make an effort to measure it. So we just don't speak about anecdotes, how corrupt we are, how unfree we are. For the first time, we made an effort to study economic freedom. So the Fraser Institute started one index. It's called the Economic Freedom of the World Index, and it's all online, available online. The Heritage Foundation, at the same time, started a similar effort. Heritage started the effort because they wanted to tell the US government that they were supporting dictators, people who don't respect freedoms. So it was more like a utilitarian goal. And then at the time, Freedom House, which is an older organization that was measuring political freedom, but was neglecting economic freedom, and it had very ridiculous results. The more labor unions you had, the more freedom they thought that you had. Imagine, I came from Argentina. My country was trapped by a sort of the Argentinian type fascism. It's called justicialismo, the party of so-called social justice of Perón, where the government, the labor unions, and business had to work line in line with what Caesar wanted, and they destroyed economic freedom. So for a couple of years, Freedom House also made an index of economic freedom. So that competition between the Fraser Institute and Heritage Foundation led to the improvement of these indices. Again, they're all available online. I recommend that you take a look at those. The name of the Heritage Index is the Index of Economic Freedom. There you can see how Croatia compares with the rest of the world. Just a caveat, a warning. Fraser at first was arguing that Heritage Foundation, which is in Washington, D.C., was a little bit politicizing some of the data. And they wanted to be sure that the research to measure economic freedom would be able to replicate it. That's a requirement in social sciences, that any of you want to go and find the data, you can check it. So Fraser, the data of Fraser is always two years old. So the economic freedom that you see today in the Fraser Index is 2 years old. At Heritage, they take the risk of working with the statistics of today, the newest statistics of today. Freedom House dropped their effort to do an index. And the size of government, which is the topic, big government, refers to the size of government. At first, that's the impression that it gives. Is measured in general statistics. When there was an economist who pushed the study of aggregates, an Englishman by the name of John Maynard Keynes gave a big push to study big aggregates, big numbers, which has a problem because, again, sometimes we forget the human being inside those numbers. But in these indices, the size of government is approximately 20% of the economic freedom comes from the size of government. There is plenty of abundance of analysis that the more economic freedom you have, the more prosperity. That led some of my fellow economists just to focus on an aspect of economic freedom like privatization. There is a famous anecdote, it's a true story, by the way, because I worked for many years, a quarter century, and was president of something called the Atlas Foundation, founded by Sir Anthony Fisher, who confronted with the decay of England. The economic freedom was going down the drains in England, despite that they had won the war. Government was growing in all the sectors, and England was really in the road to decay. And this Englishman started the Institute of Economic Affairs, an institute that changed the trend of decay in England. But then he created this other foundation to help start other think tanks, and I joined him in 1985. And he lived in the same apartment of Milton Friedman, a Nobel laureate that I also had the luck to spend a long time with him, because, again, we lived in the same city, and he lived with my boss in the same apartment building. And when the Soviet Union fell, the journalist went to Milton Friedman, was one of the best communicators in the world, very clearly, he's a great educator. But they asked him, what recommendation do you give to the former Soviet Union to reform their economy? And he said, they need three things: privatize, privatize, Privatize. Some of you are very young, but what happened during those 10 years? They did privatize, but most of the privatization were done in a corrupt way, or in what we call a crony way. You give a soft loan to a friend, the friend buys the company, and the company stays in the same hands of the previous communist leaders or those who were close to the president at the time. This happened for 10 years, and not only in the Soviet Union, in Russia. It happened in my native country, Argentina. Stephen says here, but I don't speak about Croatia because I do not know enough. I know about Argentina. There were some privatizations that were honest, and I witnessed from firsthand, but others were totally corrupt. So 10 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, the journalists come again to ask Milton Friedman, what do you think you need to do? And he said, you need to do three things: rule of law, rule of law, rule of law. It's very difficult in Latin languages to translate rule of law, because not every legislation is law. Not any government decree is law. Basically, it's ruled by law and not by men. It's the principle of equality before the law. And in Anglo-Saxon countries, we've evolved through common law. But we have realized that the rule of law is the master key that allows the free economy to produce its fruits. Without rule of law, you see some of the problems that you see here in Croatia, as you tell me, and as you can witness, about the number of people that leave this country. If everything would be rosy, why they would be going to other places. I prepared some statistics about some relevant countries that come from these indices. This is specifically from the recently released, the latest Index of Economic Freedom of the Heritage Foundation. And remember, I told you, the size of government, you measure it usually by its direct cost, and that you better measure it by spending, because government, how does it when it spends? It has to tax, it has to borrow, or they print money. Those are the three ways that government usually obtains resources, but it's better measured by how it spends. Now, there's one exception. I know that Margaret Thatcher used to say, the government cannot spend any money that it doesn't take from the people. But what about Norway? Norway is the country that has the largest amount of its GDP coming from state enterprises. With this amazing, respect that Scandinavian countries have for the rule of law still today, I don't know how long it will last, the Norwegians have managed the oil company very, very well, which is huge. So when the state has the resource and manages it very well, it manages to be able to afford a huge welfare state. Again, we cannot hide reality, and I have worked in 40, 50 countries. At Atlas, at my previous organization, we had a network in 120 countries when I left. In Acton, we have a network called Poverty Cure in more than 140 countries. And I have seen people flourish greatly during this half a century of my professional life with very different combinations of public-private sector arrangements. I'm a very champion of very radical free market economy. But in many countries, there are exceptions for culture, for politics, for different reasons. And as we will see in Scandinavia, they have been able to prosper. But there is one exception that I have never seen countries prosper for a long time, is prosper for a long time without rule of law, especially in countries that try to maintain the democratic spirit. So let me show you there the government spending. The score, the higher the score, the more free you are in this category. No? So Denmark, Finland is one of the worst in the world. Norway, Sweden, Croatia scores almost exactly like Sweden in government spending. Means you are among the 10% worst in the world, or that spend the most. Guatemala has a very tiny government sector, so it's of course one of the top 10 in the world. It's a country with larger population than Croatia, less than twice. Uruguay scores decently well, and it's a country, the population is slightly smaller than yours. The GDP must be half, I would say, perhaps of yours, or 3/4 of yours. But then see what happens with government integrity, which is one component, key component of rule of law. The Scandinavian countries score amazingly well. And when you have that combination, that people say, yes, I'm being taxed, they take money from me, but no one is getting rich in an unfair manner. Government is not giving contracts just to its friends. These countries have been able to evolve. I have friends, I studied under a disciple of great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, that a century ago said the welfare state is going to go bankrupt. They adapted. I remember being in Sweden organizing an event in a brief period where the conservatives were in power. This must be like 20-some years ago. And I never had seen such a huge disparity between expectations of people and the ability of the government to provide what people wanted. And what happened, that was only one term of the conservative government, but when the socialists came, they reduced the size of the welfare state, they reduced government spending, they applied more market incentives. I see a disparity here also, because I put there government spending. Croatia in taxation scores pretty well. It's like 70 out of 100. So obviously there is a disparity, and you will face some big issues here, because sustaining the level of government spending, I don't see how Croatia will be able to do it. But you see there, government spending alone doesn't explain the level of economic freedom. And I put there so that you don't have excuses, or for my people say, oh, it's the Catholic culture. It has nothing to do with the Catholic culture. Ireland is a Catholic country, also a small country, and scores in economic freedom this year scored number 3 in the world. Ireland used to face a much worse problem than you guys in immigration. I remember also with the Templeton Foundation, I belong to many foundations, we had an event, it was like, they would say like 15 years ago, and the speakers were saying that no one, not a single graduate in their university's business and management school had stayed in Ireland. They had all left. But look what applying more market principle has done to Ireland. So it's not size, it's not the Catholic culture, but yes, it is the culture for respect of the principles that allow human beings to have human dignity in the economic sphere. And for me, that is, respect for private property. Croatia scores well. In the best score you get is on respect, on order and security. You score 85 out of 100. You are 26 in the world, with 139 countries. This means that we feel pretty safe walking and moving. This is a human right that 4/5 of the world don't have. If you go to Latin America or Africa and you ask questions of what is that bothers you more, to a mother or a father, it is that they cannot walk safely in their neighborhood. They cannot be confident that walking to school, their little daughter or son will be not offered drugs or get into be kidnapped for sex trafficking. But unfortunately, whenever you have, I say, criminal disputes in the commercial sphere, you score one of the worst. I couldn't believe it. So in criminal justice, you score 0.49. Again, you are 56 in the world. So just to let you know how bad the world is today in respect of rule of law. And again, where 2/3 of the world doesn't have rule of law, it's hard to speak about a truly free economy. Let me go now to the next one just to show you a little bit more data. Can you put the next slide, please? And again, if you have questions about this, I can elaborate. I don't want to overwhelm you with statistics. Well, you have a question? Yeah, you want to go back then? Go ahead.
Because it is a thing that bothers me. One of the previous one of the things you had government integrity. Now, I was looking for years at this Transparency International figures. I don't know whether that comes from the same sources. But basically, what I want to ask you is, it always seems to me that government integrity is simply perceived government integrity. I mean, you know how much the government is spending. You know, but these are those statistics. But this is really like an opinion of government integrity. And I'm not suggesting that the Croatian government is honest. I just mean that it seems to me that it's dependent on comment, perception, media influence, and so on. And therefore, that's my question. Is that right?
I will answer in the third slide. Okay. So let's go to the next one, to the next slide. Well, what happened is, again, I was president of Atlas Foundation, and now called Atlas Network, and trustee of the Fraser Institute. And a big foundation called Liberty Fund started to gather Nobel laureate top economists to see if we could measure economic freedom. So I was given in advance all those papers. And when the first indices appeared, Transparency International, which was an effort within a university in Germany, began with a similar effort to try to measure corruption. Corruption is another of these things that people used to speak, but there was no measure. Like Robin said, it's a measure that comes mostly through surveys, several surveys. I think it must be the average 7 different types of surveys in different countries, where they ask participants, if they perceive corruption. Remember, and the data, by its nature, if you are in a dictatorial country and you appear in the media saying, this government official bribed me, you go to jail and you lose all your property. So it's subjective, almost or anonymous in a way, almost by need. But over the years, I found that the index of corruption gives me sometimes more predictive value than economic freedom. I will give you the case of my country, Argentina. For a while was the darling of all the new warlords and the capitalists. They were privatizing everything. But when President Menem assumed, who was the guy who led that, and they were all influenced by the world changing with Thatcher, Reagan. You know, the world was going a different way. Basically, we had a huge hydroelectric project, and he said, this hydroelectric project is a monument to corruption. As you can imagine, you know, the money was coming from the World Bank, going to the great, you know, German producers of turbines and American producers of equipment who were getting tons of money with this. In Washington, the next day, I was there, said, no, he doesn't mean it. And then, boom, they approved hundreds of millions of dollars more. At the same time, I knew how they were, how the documents, how Argentina was stealing intellectual property rights, and they were bribing, you know, pharmaceutical companies and bureaucrats. All this was going while Argentina was the darling of the world. And so that prompted me, because then people were saying, you see, it's the free market, it's the neoliberals who are causing corruption. At the time, I had with me a recent graduate of the London School of Economics, Eugenio Guzmán. He's now Dean of the School of Government at the University in Chile. So I had the first time in history, I had data of economic freedom and data about corruption, which was, as you say, limited, not very accurate. By the way, a lot of the data in economics is also surveys, and it's not hard data. When you want to measure the product, you don't go and measure it's a very complicated. It's anyone here studied economics? Basically, with Leontief, input-output matrix, you make a matrix where you guess what is the size of each sector, and then you multiply by prices that are made with surveys. It's not as accurate as you think, Robin, the data that we use as economists either. Okay, but again, at Fraser, our motto, if it matters, measure it. So we started measuring economic freedom, and transparency started measuring perception of corruption. Now, this comes from the World Justice Project. This started later, started in the 21st century, and it's a it's not ideological. The board has people from many different ideas, and they have something called the World Justice Index. You know, and this is the score of rule of law that appears there. And I put this because I think it's relevant to compare you yourself with realistic choices and the typical countries that you look sometimes for trade or for emigration and so on. You know, that's I think that's important. You know, it's not just your absolute score. You know, United States has been going down in respect of rule of law, sadly. But let me show you the results of the work that I did, and I do it every other year, of trying to measure economic freedom and corruption. Show the next slide. This is econometric, but here in the scale I put the level of economic freedom of the country, and here the level of corruption. Each dot is a different country. So again, correlation doesn't prove causation, you know. Today in the world, we don't have less babies because there are less storks, you know, because we used to say when I was young that storks bring the babies. You know? Many times there are coincidences in statistics. But for those who tell me economic freedom or economic liberalism is the cause of corruption, there are some outliers, some exceptions, but this is the case. This is one of the strongest correlations you find. The more economic freedom, the less corruption. That is the tendency and what you see in most of the world. I'm running out of time, so I want to focus a little bit in how we fight this battle. And in each country, it will be different. And in each area of economic freedom, of activity of government, you need people with different style of work. The areas that the indices measure include rule of law, and I show you some, government size, and I show you others. But then what is important is regulatory efficiency and simplicity. The reason that the Scandinavian countries score so well and Guatemala scores so bad is that despite the level of government spending, the regulations in some of the Scandinavian countries are more simple and applied to all and efficiently as compared to countries with very small governments but very corrupt and very confusing regulatory frameworks. The other area that we measure is open markets, where you measure the freedom that you have in trade, investments, and financials, and the financial sector. In all the sectors, government has been playing an increased role. My friends who blame everything on this neoliberalism, I always tell them, that the taxation level in relation to GDP is as high as it has ever been in the major economies in the OECD. Croatia is even worse, because if the average is 35, I think, of tax in relation to GDP, I think Croatia is around 45. So you are among the worst in tax burden. Now, for me, the only way to fight is through efforts like the ones that you are doing. In the United States, we have a vibrant nonprofit sector. So we have think tanks for each particular area. I will just mention some because, again, through Acton and through Fraser, and then I'm chairman of a board that I support all these groups. We support 70 free market think tanks in the United States, Canada, and England. So I can be like a conduit or to whatever expert you want. In rule of law, then we have the Federalist Society that has worked with lawyers, and most of the judges in the United States with a conservative bent has passed through Federalist Society. We have the Alliance Defending Freedom that, again, has great scholarships like the Blackstone Fellowships for people who want to train, and they're each time more international. These are organizations, by the way, of $70 million in budget, things. They're powerful nonprofits. In government size, we have Americans for Tax Reform that makes congressmen sign a pledge that they will not increase taxes. And since we started doing this, we have seen alternation in Congress. Before they passed the pledge, after President Bush father, who reneged on his promise not to raise taxes, since the 30s to that moment, the Democrats had ruled 95% of the time in Congress. 95% of the time. It was like the perfect dictatorship. Since then, we have had alternation in government, putting a straitjacket in taxation. The National Tax Foundation also focuses on taxes. And regulatory efficiency, we have the Competitive Enterprise Institute, almost focused completely on regulation, because we have a ridiculous amount of regulations. Just to let you know, for example, in the banking sector, if you are a small bank, it's almost impossible to grow. One bank alone, like the Pittsburgh National Bank, they have 1,200 lawyers. One bank alone to fulfill, and the tax declarations, are also thousands of pages. In open market, again, most of the think tanks that I work with, we are in favor of free trade, but trade with companies controlled by the Chinese Communist Party or by cronies of Putin or by the dictatorship of Iran. That's, for me, is not a definition of free trade. Because I said, for me, a free economy, freedom in economics is the right to do what you want with what you own. They don't own, I should have said, you legitimately own. If you stole property or you have property from slave labor, I don't think that those companies own that. I will finish now with, that's the open battle. Perhaps you will read if you study the United States. The forces of big government have lots of money. For decades, we thought it was impossible to defeat the entrenched bureaucracy, now called the deep state. It was perfected in Turkey during the 70 years rule of the Kemalist, where no matter who rules, the bureaucrats control everything, and especially when big government sides with big corporation is a monster very difficult to defeat. Dark money is the money that groups like non-profits like the United States, like the ones I am a member of, we don't have to disclose everything, all our donors. We have to do it to the revenue service, but not to the general public, and means using your money to pass a political message without calling it that it is a political message, or to, that means you, as a researcher or as a support the Center for the Renewal of Culture, you come up with a message that is exactly the one that the politician wants. And that has no limits how much money you can spend. For a while, the conservatives were ahead, I would say in 2014, 2015. But then the socialists took the leadership, and George Soros moved $18 billion to play this game. And that's only one donor, okay, $18 billion. So, and they have perfected the art, and I will finish with this. I suffered a lot professionally with the reversal in Chile. In Chile, all these numbers were superb for decades. They had created think tanks. They created universities. Poverty went down more than anywhere else in the world. Still, the socialists won, and now they have a socialist president. They lost an election to have a disastrous constitution, luckily the socialists. But I saw that reversal, and I wondered what was going on. And I realized that our side was very weak in trying to capture agencies on strategies and processes. I don't know if you read Lenin when he said, I don't care what is discussed as long as I write the minutes. And I think that's something that we need to do. Soros has invested billions in capturing prosecutors, state prosecutors. I do not know what the name in Croatian. It's like the chief prosecutor in a state jurisdiction. Half of the cities in the United States are controlled by people that George Soros, with his foundation, was able to choose. And if they have to decide about electoral fraud or combating violence, which again is a total attack for me on economic freedom and on private property, if the guys who have to decide, how you put in practice the free economy, side with the criminals, it's almost impossible to win the battle. Luckily, in the United States, we have donors that are supporting to combat that. So, long story short, you have to continue to work in each of these areas as much as you can. You have to work in the field of ideas. You have to train leaders like you do here. You never have to forget the importance of the family and private property as the key incentives. And then pray for some luck, that you will have some victories, that some leaders like Stephen will one day play a bigger role in the country, and never stop working. In politics, I think there are never permanent losses, but never permanent victories. So it's a never-ending job. So good luck, and I'm looking forward to listen to Robin's ideas on this topic of economic freedom and the big government that we have today. Thank you so much for your attention.